Hello and welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and this week I'm going to have a conversation with economist Bob Murphy about one of our two favorite subjects, which is how a society can achieve law and order and peace and prosperity without a centralized state. We're talking about Ancapistan, so called, versus Minarchism, so called. And if you're interested in these subjects, and I hope you are, if you watch this little show, you'll love this. We go deep into a bunch of really interesting areas about typical objections to not having a monopoly state and knocking those objections down and finding new ways to form our intuitions. Why is it that people just almost reflexively assume that such a system can't work? I don't think that's an accident. And we get into all of that on this episode, so please enjoy. Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
I'm very excited today, Bob, because I
Why is
heard a
that?
rumor that we're going to talk about one of my very favorite subjects of all time, libertarian anarcho-capitalism.
All right. Yes. I thought you were excited because we weren't doing clips.
We are not a clip show, I swear. So, yeah, why are we talking about Ancapistan, so called?
All right. So, yeah, the context of this is I recently gave a talk for the Menger Institute, and they had a online course that they were doing, and they were talking about anarchy and said, "Hey, can you give a talk on that?" And I said, "Sure." So I recorded that, and then I asked them, I'll give you guys, I won't scoop you, but once you show your people, can I upload it to my YouTube channel? So I did that. It was a self-contained talk on private law and private defense. And then one of the comments on my YouTube channel on that talk is what Adam's going to read you in a minute. And I saw that. So, this is a very common issue coming from minarchists. And so I thought this would be fodder for an episode.
Absolutely. We'll put a link in the video description to that video and also to the Menger Institute, which is a new thing teaching Austrian economics and all sorts of other good things to the young folks. I think it's a pretty new organization, right? That you're a part of?
I mean, I'm not, I gave them a talk, so I'm not like formally part of them per se. But
Then I
yeah,
will quit asking you follow-up
yeah,
questions that you were not prepared to deal
yeah,
with.
I am. It's like the population of Iran. What does it matter whether they're new or old, or how old are they? You tell me.
2 years. I had
So what does it matter? What's 1 year, 3 years? What's
I had Matt. Yeah, exactly. I've got the range. As long as you tell me the bullseye. I had Matthew Geiger, one of their young professors, on the show several months ago. I'll link to that discussion too. He had an interesting argument for how the state increases suicide in the universe that I thought was pretty interesting. Anyway, so yeah, let me just
in
read
Canada, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's
They
not
say,
called.
how about
They
we
don't even
kill
call
you?
that.
Yeah,
They call it Tuesday. You've entered November, as they say, and there is no December. All right, so here is the complaint lodged on YouTube comments. Quote, there are some practical problems with this idea, especially when it comes to public safety. With no government-run prisons, police forces, or courts, criminals will group together, form gangs, purchase their own private property, and then use their financial resources to hire their own crony police and court services. There needs to be one set of laws protecting life, liberty, and private property rights, which apply to everyone living within a certain geographic area. This means that there needs to be a centralized authority that establishes and enforces the laws protecting people's natural rights. This is the only way for the non-aggression principle to truly flourish. I can say yes to minarchy, but I cannot agree with anarcho-capitalism. If it fails at the thought experiment level, it will definitely fail in the real world, end quote.
Okay, so folks, Adam and I were chit-chatting before we started this thing, and if you think our conversations are boring when we're recording, can you imagine when we think, wait, it's not quite the quality that our listeners demand? And we think we could go for a long time on this. There's all sorts of, it was completely novel. Something just popped into my head, Adam, as you were reading it, as it occurred to me that, and you tell me, is this fair or unfair? There was a kids show that I used to watch where the kids would complain about something their parents would do, and then the guy would ask the audience, fair or unfair? And then the audience,
Okay.
and almost 9 out of 10 times, I think the kids in the audience agreed that what the kids' parents were doing was unfair.
Amazing.
Yes. So anyway, I was thinking, so he's big on minarchy. Okay, clearly the system that is being implemented all over the world right now is not anarcho-capitalism. I mean, if you want to, we can be generous and give, Somalia and a few other places that people would say, oh, if you don't like government, why don't you move to that place? Okay, so what 3 jurisdictions on planet Earth right now we might say are more anarchy than a state? Okay, and so that the state approach is clearly not working. Minarchy is not a stable system, right? So that the approach of let's have law and order, run by the state, that is clearly failing all over the place, even though the various places involved would all say that, oh yeah, we're not going to have a system where we have like 2 tiers of justice, where like the ruling elite have one set of rules that apply to them, whereas the common folk have a different set of rules. And that like if you're rich or powerful in some sense connected to the government, the police will let you get away with certain things, right? So what's motivating me going down this path is just him saying, criminals will group together, form gangs, purchase their own private property, and then use their financial resources to hire their own crony police and court services, right? So if you said, does that description apply to anywhere on Earth? I think to varying degrees, you'd say yes, everywhere. Like even in the United States, it's well known that, at least certain types of people with connections or get away. I mean, as we're speaking, like what Epstein list? What are you talking about? Like that's the news right now as Adam and I are recording, folks, that's going out, right? So clearly what he's saying is true right now. And, he could say, oh, it's because none of them are trying minarchy. I suppose that would be the move he would make. But in any event, I just want to say that it's clear the experiment in let's try to have a government that's aiming for the ideal he just stated, that doesn't work. It's not just right now, the static, snapshot in time, looking backwards in history. I mean, whatever, you want to say, oh, the United States. Okay, well, that experiment failed too, right? So it has never, minarchy, the way he's talking about it and what he's shooting for, has literally never worked ever. And there's been hundreds or thousands, depending on how you quantify it, of attempts. And so, he's saying that anarchy fails in theory. Okay, well, minarchy fails in practice for sure. So anyway, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I wasn't too impressed with the theory/reality argument because much like Ayn Rand before him, he just came up with sort of one wonky example of what might happen and said, see, the theory fails. I mean, I don't think that exactly is a strong enough set of arguments to qualify as a theory that has failed some sort of empirical test or even thought experiment test. I wasn't impressed. I think this commenter, I think he was motivated by your assertion that in an ANCAP society, we wouldn't necessarily need prisons as commonly conceived as we currently have. And you were relying on the right of property owners to exclude people from that property. And remember, in ANCAP land, there's just no such thing as public property. So if a reputable judge rendered a judgment that such and such person is an awful, horrible rapist, murderer, thief, and all good people should probably not allow them on their property, then this poor individual would find himself in a situation where he's just not allowed to be anywhere. And in such an environment, you can imagine charities and even for-profit businesses opening up that would say, okay, well, no one else will allow you anywhere, so we'll let you be here and give you some kind of job and guard you, and you can work off your debt, or at least you will be able to exist somewhere rather than having to levitate off into the stratosphere because you're not allowed on any square inch of private property. And I think this fellow is saying, well, that's just not enough because crime does pay at least enough for gangs to be able to buy property, and so the guy will just retreat in there, and that's not good enough. And I think we're battling against just like a lack of imagination. People just can't see how, yeah, that is good enough. Like, isn't it kind of good that, let's say they were able to retreat into this little gangland, that they aren't allowed anywhere else? They have to stay on that reservation. And if they come out, they might get shot. And let's say they owed restitution. You could imagine a judge rendering an opinion that would allow a security company attached to some insurance company to go in there and, extract resources because it is owed and the judgment has been rendered. And who cares if they've got their own court? It's not regarded as reputable to anyone else in the society. So I think that's what was motivating it. That thing that there wouldn't be prisons, so therefore there wouldn't be. I think just reflexively, we've got a knee-jerk inertia to assume that the only way you can get law and order is with a sovereign. And so we just have to have one, and they can't see how you get order without a sovereign.
Right. So let me just read this sentence in question again. So he says, folks, with no government-run prisons, police forces, or courts. So Adam, I'm fine, and I'll go ahead and respond to the tension you raised, because I think you're right in general. I think he was more focused on the with no government-run prisons as opposed to just like you made it sound like he's like, oh, there's no prisons. So but it's equivalent in terms of what we think he was putting emphasis on. But yeah, he definitely says with no government-run prisons, police forces, or courts, criminals will group together, form gangs, purchase their own private property, and then use their financial resources to hire their own crony police and court services. So clearly, he just to generalize, and again, folks, I picked this specific guy because I've heard this type of complaint all over the place for decades at this point, is to say, oh, yeah, market competition works for pizza shops and buying cars and computers and whatnot. We all agree that. But when it comes to the enforcement of laws and deciding who's going to end up in a cage, for one thing is you need there just to be a single set of rules. Like the rule of law just conceptually means there's just got to be one body. So how could you have competition? That doesn't even make sense. And we'll come back to that in a minute if we want, Adam. But then beyond that, right, to say if somehow you're going to be trying to harness market forces and have different companies with market share, like, wouldn't they just be battling it out in the streets or something? Or wouldn't it just be that the richest people, the companies are going to do whatever the highest bidder says? Or, if judges, wouldn't they just be selling verdicts? All right. And so,
as opposed to what's happening right now, say.
Right, exactly. And so, and I don't mean to be coy, because I think sometimes when we speak like that, people think that we're, doing the equivalent of saying that the United States right now is Nazi Germany or something, or you know what I mean? Or, oh, this is Pol Pot, Donald Trump, what's the difference? That kind of, when they're like, come on, guys, you're being crazy. There's lots of people all over the world who would love to come here. And, just ask Dave Smith, he wants to keep them out. And so, but let's just walk through that. So clearly the difference is not simply like, oh, because we have, thank God that we had James Madison was one of our forefathers, and we can give written constitutions to former Russian satellites, and it doesn't work, right? So it's not the parchment that's on the U.S. Constitution. It is, the belief system that the people have and their cultural values and ideas towards property rights and what's acceptable for the government to do, that kind of thing, that I think is what allows for our system to be relatively better than most others. And so when you start pushing back on that or picking through it, that's why I'm saying right. And so my suggested framework of how this could happen in a voluntary society, the type of people that would make a statist society better than a different one, than a different group of people in a statist society, right? That's also what would make decentralized judicial services better, right? So to give an example, like this guy, I don't know exactly what framework he wants, but he must have a thing where, well, periodically, like, how do we know what the laws are? The single body, we must have elections or some way of the people expressing their viewpoints. And then, well, what if the 30% loses the election to the 70%? Do they just form their own little group and they have 30% of the guns over here and they battle it out in the street. Well, no, because it's an election. We decide things through voting. And so we all just agree that, hey, we're not going to, turn to guns if we don't get our way. And right, okay, and that's how, a democratic limited state can work if the vast majority of the population agrees. We might have differences on abortion. We might have differences on, tax rates and blah, blah, blah. And, we might even have different views on like how many innocent people how many guilty people should be set free in our judicial system such that we don't convict an innocent person, and then like the trade-offs and whatever.
Yeah.
But let's all agree that we're not going to use guns to solve these differences. We're going to use a peaceful, and I'm saying, okay, right. And so if you have a people that's willing to do that, why then, if you just had a competitive framework like the one I'm talking about, would they say, well, I don't care what's right or wrong. I'm just going to pay, and if I know some judge just sells his verdicts to the highest bidder, as long as I can outbid any likely person I'm going to face in his trial, well, that's cool. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, you're like assuming a completely different population. The kind of people for which, last thing I'll say here, Adam, this guy's right that he can dream up a population for which the framework I'm describing, it wouldn't work. It would dissolve into rampaging warfare. But I'm saying if you take that same group of people and try to have them administer a limited night watchman state, that's going to be an even worse disaster.
Exactly. Yeah,
so that's what I'm trying to say.
People in our camp don't make that point enough, that ultimately it's the culture of the people in the society that is going to determine what it's like to be in that society. And just as you can't go to Somalia and give them a piece of paper and say, here, this is how you run your constitutional Jeffersonian republic. You can't go over there and give them 18 Bob Murphy lectures and have them figure out, how to create a bottom-up legal structure and security services. The only reason our country isn't just an absolute hellhole is because most of us believe in, sandbox ethics. You keep to yourself and you don't steal from other people. And that's really the big thing that keeps us a civil society. It's not government necessarily. That only works on the margins.
Before moving on, let me just hammer that point home that I want to make sure people aren't misunderstanding. So I'm not merely saying, and Adam's agreeing with me, that, oh, hey, it's ultimately the culture and the political system's kind of irrelevant. No, I'm saying
right.
You're much more likely to contain abuse through a competitive, decentralized legal and judicial and police enforcement system.
As in your example, the corrupt guy who bribed the corrupt judge. In our system, that just gets entrenched and we can't do anything about it. But in Ancapistan, we get to reiterate this game theory. People will become aware that this judge is corrupt and his reputation will sink so low that in future, no one else will agree to be arbitrated by him or judged by him.
Yeah. So to give a mundane example, someone say, well, okay, how do you, in your society, Murphy, how do you figure out like who runs the pizza shops? Like how many pizza shops? You say, oh, it's open. It's decentralized. There is no authority in charge of that. Anyone wants to open a pizza shop, they can get the money to do so. And you say, oh, well, what if it just so happens that every single person selling pizza is just a crook and they will do everything they can to just steal from their customer? And yeah, you might say, but come on, like what if every single person who happens to go into pizza shop, retail, just is like one of the worst people around and just poisons people occasionally if he doesn't like them and just, uses real shoddy ingredients. You can't prove to me that that's literally impossible. Can you? And I would say, no. And then if he says, and so that's why we need to have the government pick one person to run all the pizza shops in order, and then we'll periodically have elections to make sure. You see how that would be stupid, right? And that's what this guy's doing when it comes to, the police and so forth.
Yeah, we are a little bit hypnotized. I mean, I called it inertia a second earlier, but since we've only existed in this one structure, this one system, we can't imagine how order could come from any other source than one centralized authority figure. Sometimes when I'm talking about anarchism and where law comes from, I'll say, look, people want different rules for different situations. And, the rules you have in your family are probably going to be different than the rules you have in an HOA, say. and the Amish are going to have a different set probably. And then when you leave your area and go into someone else's store or a bunch of stores, there's probably going to be some sort of a uniform business code of conduct. Maybe there'll be 5 or 6, maybe 2 or 3. And you'll see the sign on the door. Oh, in here, I can't do this and that or the other. And there'll be a different one for, different arenas in life, like, I don't know, the UFC or whatever, traveling to other areas. And I think people just can't conceive of something different, more dynamic than one overarching legal structure, rather than something that would be much more useful, which is, different, you actually physically signing on the dotted line and opting into a legal structure you're willing to abide by in different circumstances. And it's, there's something we've got to be able to do to break people out of the rigid mindset that makes them think that within a specific geographical area, there must be only one lawgiver. That's, again, it's something we're spoon-fed that since we're infants, and we can't think our way out of that trap. It's vexing.
Yeah. So I'm trying not to shy away from saying things I've said elsewhere because it bears repeating. But one thing, just to make sure people, to shake them out of that, is to say, if what you think we have right now with the state running the show is one set of laws that apply to everybody equally, that's not correct. And I don't even mean like the nod and a wink that the rich people have one set of rules. Like I'm saying, no, even in a given, like certainly everyone on planet Earth is not subject to the same rules, even though just about everyone on Earth is subject to a government. And so they say, oh yeah, I don't mean like we can have different jurisdictions. You can have different types of rule, but within each thing. And so, okay, in the United States, it differs from state to state, right? That in some states there's capital punishment, other states there's not. The speed limit's certainly different. There's all sorts of different laws, not just customs, that apply when you cross state borders. You say, oh, yeah, but that's still consistent with federalism. So, and you can keep pushing it down. So even right there, I'm just saying, even on their own terms, it gets pretty small. And so one way of saying, okay, well, fine, we stipulate that framework, and just in anarcho-capitalism, we think the ultimate unit, the sovereign unit, should be the individual homeowner, or whoever owns the building or something, and that's like it's your own country. And so I can do it in your frame. Hey, I'm a minarchist too, and it's just every single household is a castle, and that's the Republic of Adam Haman.
How did you know what I was going to name it?
Everyone behind the scenes, that the Queen is actually running the show. Everyone kind of knows that.
True. So, it's true.
So that's one way of doing it. And they say, oh no, that's not what I mean. Well, okay, well, what do you mean? So I'm saying there's that element, and people, again, it's the sort of thing where if you think, no, that doesn't, we got to have more, bigger jurisdictions. Okay, well then why not all planet Earth? So are you in favor of one world government? No, that would be tyrannical. Okay, so I'm saying a lot of this stuff where they have these quick phrases they throw out, and you realize, no, it's okay if in some states abortion is legal. When I say okay, I don't mean it's optimal or something. I'm just saying we realize you can get along, and it's not that we all die because there's different rules that apply at different places. And then moreover, because what would the profit and loss test is what would spit out what the correct rules would be, in this kind of a framework. I know that sounds horrifying to people, but that's also why, like, you can go into a McDonald's anywhere around the world and kind of know what you're going to get. Right. And so likewise, if people would know, like, hey, I want to have contract enforcement, and you will go to that kind of a judge, and you kind of know what you're going to get, because it's the same principles that determine, what they produce for their customers. So
it's weird.
Yeah.
People who are stuck in the minarchist framework or just the statist framework, they really don't have any power in their mental module that lets them see the power of just being able to say no to a particular institution. Because we can't say it to our government. There's just nothing we can do unless we, flee or, try and get citizenship in some other country. But think how much powerful it'll be, and what incredible protection against abuse it is to just be able to say, oh, well, this institution sucks. I'm not going to deal with it anymore. There are other people that want my business. It's very powerful. Sometimes I think like it wasn't really philosophical arguments or rights-based arguments that got, gay people their rights in this country. It was Will and Grace. And I think we need something like that for libertarianism or anarchism. Ancapistan. We need hundreds and hundreds of examples of a society that, such as the one we're envisioning, just working in the background in narrative and books and TV shows and movies. I think people just need to see something working in a narrative structure that there's no calamity, in order for them to get the idea that it might be okay, that it might work. You know what I mean? Like right now, we just don't have anything like that. The only time you see the government not there, it's in a fiction. It's a dystopian. And
Are you saying we need a gay John Galt? Is that what you're saying?
gay Ayn Rand, maybe not. Yeah, maybe exactly something like that. I mean, I've read a few books.
Hey, me too.
In which something like an Ancapistan is sort of functioning, and everything's fine. You know, you do get order, and you get competition in what the rules are, with the, you know, more than just the norms, the actual security services and laws, and exclusion is, again, a very powerful deterrent. So I just think we need more of that in stories. I don't know how that's ever going to happen, but
I'm, as people may know, I dabbled and wrote a novel in grad school on that stuff. Am I right in saying, for whatever reason, the existing genre of that tends to be sci-fi?
Yeah.
So is that partly why it's handicapped, that it's always set, like it doesn't seem real?
Yeah. When this is working for us, a sitcom will have Ancapistan as, you know, the backdrop. And they won't even really be talking about the political structure, the legal structure, or whatever. It'll just be the way that's just how things are working within the characters. Mm-hmm. And they won't even focus on it. They'll be telling the gags or the jokes or the setups or whatever.
So instead of a show about nothing, it'll be a show about anarchism.
Exactly. You get to work on that, Bob.
Yeah. Instead of central perk, it'll be decentralized perk. If you're Friends reference, folks.
Okay. Yeah, very nice.
Okay. I do like what you're saying there, and I think you're right. Let me just say one last thing on the principle, because it's such an important. I thought another analogy that you could say, hey, we can't have decentralized schools, right? You can't just have competing for-profit companies, or, you know, you might say, oh, it's a nonprofit, you know, but you still got to meet the bottom line or something, right? Even if you're relying on donations from the church or whatnot. And, you know, for all we know, they could be teaching different times tables or something. You need to have the state establish a single curriculum that, you know, kids need to all be learning the same body of science and times tables. Otherwise, that'd be crazy, right? You have groups over here paying their teachers to teach kids division one way, and over here, you know, they'd be teaching them with different hands. That'd be nutty. How could that work? You could see the fallacy there. And in fact, it's not simply that, the two are equivalent. It's that actually the way to ensure uniformity and that most of the children actually do learn, quote, the same body of math and science would be through a decentralized competitive system where no institution can compel the kids in that region to go to that school, where the parents ultimately can say, no, we'll homeschool, forget that. Like, that really is the ultimate check, which perhaps paradoxically ensures that most of the system of the schools in that framework end up teaching, quote, the same thing.
And
they
the
might
same
just use
thing
different methods for narrowly enough to find. For things where we can all agree, yeah, it should be the same.
Right, and the aim of all these decentralized curriculum makers will be aimed at something sensible, the demands of the people who want to employ these future citizens, rather than just what some bureaucrat determines, or what the Texas State School Board or whatever decides on for the whole country. Yes. In the guy's, just assuming it's a guy because it's a theoretician talking about anarchy.
Clearly
it's obviously
I would be
a guy.
Stunned if the person said, no, I'm a woman. I would say, were you born a guy? And they might say, well, what business of that is yours? You know.
All I'm saying is that at 4-1 odds, I know which way I'm betting. Yeah, so I assume it's a guy. He clearly seems worried that in an ANCAP system, criminal gangs would become too powerful. Mm-hmm. And it's not that just, the guy could evade justice and hide out in his gang property. I think he thinks that that the gangs, the criminals, would end up like outnumbering all the rest of us.
Yep.
And it's like, no, man, because this is America and part of Western civilization, and we have a certain culture, most people don't want to just rob everybody. And so the forces of defense from predation are just obviously going to be more well-funded and more powerful than whatever these gang members are doing. I mean, we think of gang members as like being rich and powerful, but remember, that's only because we have a stupid drug war on drugs that gives them a way to make money that's like almost legitimate. You can find a willing buyer and a willing seller. There wouldn't be anything like that in Ancapistan. Criminals would actually be criminals, and nobody would, be on their side. They'd be vastly outnumbered by the forces of righteousness.
Yeah. So real quick, there was a period where I would read some of the the nonfiction stuff like Underboss, the story of Sammy the Bull Gravano. That I just saw the cover and that popped into my head. And then also I read on John Gotti Jr. I read like a biography of him or something like that. So anyway, you're exactly right, Adam. That if you think through like how does the mafia, in the context of the United States, how do they earn their income? Like how can they be, a criminal enterprise? What do? They prostitution, gambling, drug dealing, loan sharking, which means charging. It doesn't merely mean if you don't pay us back, we break your kneecaps. It also means charging interest rates that would technically be illegal for other places, in violation of usury laws and stuff like that, right? So all sorts of things that are services that their clients want, and the government heavily regulates or forbids. And that's why they go to criminals to provide them. It is not simply the mafia does not earn its revenue from going around mugging people, or robbing banks or something like that. No, it is areas where there is the fundamental activity is a voluntary transaction, and then they use coercion around the edges. And certainly they use coercion to keep away competitors. But again, so if you had an anarcho-capitalist system where though presumably the profit and loss, it would not be illegal to engage in quote victimless crimes, then that stuff all goes away, and you have actual legitimate business people running those things, just like organized crime was in alcohol production during the 20s. And then once you legalize it, say what you will about the shareholders of Budweiser or Anheuser-Busch or whatever, they don't do drive-by shootings, right? So that's what you. And then also like just reading about, I think that I'm talking about John Gotti Jr. now and the stuff. They would do stuff like there were certain areas in New York, I forget where, if he was in Brooklyn or where, I forget where he was. But yeah, certain people really liked him, and then when the government was trying to make a case against him, they stood by John Gotti and blah, blah. And what? Because he would do stuff like they would have fireworks, and if some old lady got swindled, she would go tell him, and they would take care of it. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying they had a fair trial with evidentiary rules and whatever, and maybe they punished the wrong guy or did so, but I'm saying they were not just clearly, quote, a lawless organization going around rampaging like the Huns and the people were cowering. No, they were providing justice because the local system, the cops and whatever, were all corrupt, and they weren't listening to them, right? So that's, kind of like in the Godfather when
they made it a plot point in the Godfather too. Yeah.
Why did you go to the police? Why did you come to me? And so anyway, I'm just saying that you're right. So the two-pronged thing, if the state didn't prohibit all that stuff, they wouldn't have that flow of funds. And then also, if the police and courts and blah, blah, blah were actually well-functioning providers of those services, then the people wouldn't turn to the mafia to say, hey, can you help me out here? Because I'm not getting justice over here, right? Just like they don't turn to the mafia and say, can you give me a good steak dinner? Because there's no steakhouses in this city worth a damn. Like, that doesn't happen. So yes, it's far from organized crime taking over in ANCAP society. It's the other way around. They would wither away.
People who object to Ancapistan, they usually, like when you were talking about, who would build the roads if we didn't have a government, and you start saying, well, hey, look, these are just technical skills. It's not government employees necessarily that are building these roads. It's just men who know how to lay asphalt and do all this stuff. But of course, the true objection is that people, for whatever reason, seem to think that you need an overarching sovereign in order to coordinate action and block obstructionist recalcitrants and keep greedy people from just getting in the way of progress or something. And I don't have in my pocket a handful of intuitions to try and knock down those objections. Do you have any in yours? I mean, how can you make people see that absent a government coercive monopoly, we would want to get from here to there? There would be money in it, as well as other incentives to building these things and coordinating these things. You know, maybe they wouldn't look like the interstate highway system, but maybe that wasn't the right way to build, you know, travel.
I mean, that would be a good thing. Like that. That's one of Walter Block's great points on that stuff. Is I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember the statistics, just showing how many thousands of people die on government roads in the United States every year, and said if this were a private industry and this was the statistic, how much, you know, there'd be congressional hearings day in and day out about what it is. People are dropping like flies, but now it's, oh, well, they, you know, the guy was a drunk driver. He was going too fast, or he should get his brakes checked. Like they don't, and there's certain things too, like, you know, with certain large cities will have particular intersections and things that are just death traps.
Yeah.
And that, you know, and just the process of, they should really do something about that, you know, because a lot of people die every year at that intersection. And you know, just you just think through, like, you know, if it's Atlanta or something, just all the committees and all the stuff that's got to happen before they go in and say, hey, maybe we should make this a 4-way stop, or, you know, whatever the fix is, put in another lane or something, put in speed bumps, whatever. That it just takes a lot longer to do that. Whereas if the things were all privately owned, then, you know, and somebody were either losing money depending on the liability or whatever the issue is, or just weren't earning as much revenue because people came to realize that's a dangerous thing, and so they would choose alternates. In other words, if people in the area know to avoid that intersection, particularly around 5 o'clock, because it's just crazy, and you're probably going to get, you know, not probably, but, you know, you're much more likely to get an accident, you go that route than this other route. There's no city bureaucrat whose pay is $100,000 less that year because of that fact. Right. Whereas if you owned the stuff and it was like, you know, you were charging people somehow, like, because, you know, there was electronic billing or something like that, and you just had a 10% reduction, there'd be millions of dollars a year less just because of that effect alone, whether, you know, putting aside liability and stuff, if you could be sued for having, you know, an intersection that was a death trap. So just things like that. And then also, it's not like, oh, when you try to leave your country and go into another country, you're driving up and all of a sudden the road ends. It's like, damn it, because our government ends here and they couldn't come up with a way to coordinate with this other jurisdiction and this other sovereign, just because you clearly need to have one group in charge of the whole thing for roads to work. Like, no, that doesn't happen. Or within Disney World, you're not riding the monorail and then all of a sudden you smash into a brick wall. Because how do a private business know how to make things work like that? How can you move people from here? It's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. So many questions for you. So in the video we're going to link to, you describe kind of what, not a prison exactly, but places for people to go for whom no one else will allow them on their property.
I'm sorry, can I stop you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just, there was an anecdote that I told for years at the Mises Institute when we were talking about roads, and I'll try to do the real quick version, but there was some guy, and I found it that, like, there was a PBS documentary on him or something like that, and he was, I think, Belgian, but I could be wrong about that, but, you know, one of those places over there.
They're all the same.
And he was a maverick road designer, and his theory was, if you have to use traffic lights or signs, you failed. That's too much, you know, paternalism or whatever. And so he had like roundabouts and stuff like that, like just things that
I think it might have been in the Scandinavian, one of the Scandinavian countries where I think you're right, roundabouts everywhere.
Yeah. And so here I'm telling the story to the kids at Mises U, and I say, and so there's this great video that I'll, you know, give you guys the link or whatever, where he's talking to the reporter, like, as they're making this documentary, and he's explaining his theories, and so they come up to a roundabout that he designed, and you can see, you know, that the people are coming real fast in, and then they're confused. And that's his whole theory, like, you want the driver to be a little
slow down,
you know, uneasy. Like, because this thing is, if you just think, no, the rules are in place such that I can zone out, I can be looking at my phone, I can be playing with the radio, because the signs and the lights are going to take care of that. You're not paying attention. That's how accidents happen. If something goes wrong and that signal doesn't get through to somebody, boom, that somebody dies, right? So you want people to be a little bit off, off put or whatever, driving. So he's talking to the lady, and he's going up to this intersection he designed, and then to prove to her, so I'm telling the kids, and to prove just how much he trusted his system, he turns around and starts walking backwards out into the traffic.
Wow.
And then I go, now he died, but still, the thing is, and so they would get a laugh, and then, but he didn't die. The cars just all went around him. So, and that's true. Like in this documentary, you do see the guy turns around, walks backwards, just steps off the curb right into the oncoming traffic, and he doesn't die because they're already slowing down because, like, what the hell is this? You come up to a roundabout, you're not sure what you're doing and whatever. So,
yeah, I saw that video just years ago now, but it's powerful. Yeah, you want a system that engages this thing here between your ears, not one where the driver just assumes the system's got it under control.
I'm sorry, but the point is not to say, so therefore governments around the world should mandate that approach. No, it's saying have open competition. Maybe the way that we think roads are supposed to work in the United States, maybe that's a poor design, and that there's other things. I know actually I'm in Massachusetts, there's roundabouts all over the place, but I think they call them rotaries up here.
Right.
We don't even use the same word. There could be different words. How can that be? Like, shouldn't the federal government enforce one word for that thing? So the point being that, it's not a good thing to say, oh, all the roads need to be made the same. No, maybe hundreds of thousands of people die over the course of a decade that don't need to because we locked in one design that actually there's a better design and we're just never going to find it now.
Yeah, you definitely don't want any particular system mandated, even if the roundabout one is right, quote unquote, for now, because you can easily imagine that system like ending up winning the competition battle. And then really, really quick, all of a sudden we turn things over to a highly centralized structure with like AI in control or something, where it is the case that the driver or the passenger doesn't need to pay attention at all. And yeah, you don't get these sorts of discovery processes with anything but free market competition. So yeah, I had a question about your the way you were describing prisons as sort of evolving from the fact that outlaws wouldn't be allowed anywhere. And it gave rise to this question. I can imagine entering into social contracts that are different, where I would be saying, okay, I agree that I'm going to do business, buy in exchange for you letting me walk in here and buy Twinkies at your 7-Eleven. I agree that if I rape your wife and murder your cashier, you can put me before a... Uh-oh, are you okay?
I don't know what that was. Somebody came in and did not sign a
consent
form.
if you're dragged off camera by a shadowy figure, we'll know what happened.
It'll be a failure of the state.
The state.
It's not in Somalia where I'm broadcasting from. So still, tell my story.
So do you see any problem conceptually with me agreeing to, something like, trial by jury, and then you can throw me in prison if I violate these X, Y, and Z things?
I was wondering where the heck you were going with this. Yeah. Not that I doubted you. I just couldn't see.
Because I can see that being... Right. I can see us getting there before we get to something as more evolved as what you're talking about.
Okay, so let me just make sure we're not losing people. So very quickly, folks, what I did in my pamphlet Chaos Theory, which had the essay Private Law, is I was thinking through the issue of, like the vast majority of people, they're biased, but they're not monsters. In like when there's legal disputes that they can't resolve, an employer and employee, like it's, again, they want to be part of civil society and whatnot. And it's just, they're biased, self-interested, and they can't agree on stuff. And so that's the function of having a third party judge, is they both say, you know what, I think that, I did enough work and you owe me this back pay, and you say no, that my work was shoddy. We're not going to agree to this. Let's go submit to this arbitrator and we'll abide by his decisions because we got to settle this somehow. Okay, because I think I'm right, you think you're right. Let's go see what this guy says. And he's got a reputation for ruling in this area. 9 out of 10, approval ratings from thousands of different people who submitted their cases, right? But what about the axe murderer? That kind of stuff where it's not that he says, hey, you were against me killing your family, and you were the lone survivor, and why don't we just work this? Like, that's not, that model seems like it doesn't work for people like that. But then the problem was, I had trouble like in this decentralized framework of competing legal codes and stuff like that and trying to get as much consent as possible in order for rules to be applied to you. It was like, well, if some guy's just going around and he's this rogue and he's not agreeing to anything, what do you do with that? And I felt uncomfortable just saying, well, in that case, you know, as long as 4 Rothbardians agree, then you can go and send the paddy wagon and grab the guy and just make sure you don't hurt him too much if you don't have, like, it was just so arbitrary. I was like, I can't. So I said, what you can do for sure, that there's no dispute, is you can say, if there's a guy like that, I don't want him on my land, right? And the more egregious his behavior, the more people that would just automatically say, yeah, get the heck off my land. And so then in that framework, I said, oh, there would arise oases, the plural of oasis, either for-profit institutions or like, you know, churches running things for the, you know, the outcasts of society. We help you, brother, that kind of stuff, whatever. That would take people in and they would search them at the door and make sure they don't have shivs on them and stuff like that. But hey, you can come here and work and we'll monitor you. And if you're an engineer, we'll give you an internet connection. You can do stuff but earn your keep and blah, blah, blah. Right. Okay. And so now I take it, Adam, you're saying, okay, Bob, I get how you're trying to avoid just arbitrarily saying what groups are allowed to go grab people and throw them in a cage. But could there be things that I did consent to where I did say, kind of as a standing rule, if I'm convicted of a serious, you know, violent crime by any of these reputable, you know, and you could in the contract or in the pledge specify what do you mean by a reputable court and blah, blah, blah. And I have the right to appeal, but yeah. And you could have agreed to all that ahead of time. Yes, I absolutely think that, especially like, I don't think so much necessarily like to go into a convenience store and buy Twinkies, but I do think, like to go live in a certain neighborhood, like in their analog of the HOA or something, like you're agreeing, I'm not going to have a rusty car sitting on my lawn. I can't play music at 3 a.m., blah, blah, blah. And then, yes, if I am credibly accused of a violent crime, I do concede or, you know, forfeit my rights. And I do give permission that the security forces of the HOA or whatever they call themselves, you know, the Ridgewood Estates or something, can come in and incarcerate me. I will be provided with legal counsel and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, if they can't make charges stick, you know what I mean? So it would look like our thing where they can't just memory hole you.
Of course.
But yeah, but it is the case that, yeah, if they accuse you of something really serious, like, you know, the people show up and there's just blood everywhere in your next door neighbor's house. And there's video footage of a guy who looks just like you killing people that like, they can go grab you. And you've technically agreed to that ahead of time. That, yeah, if I ever find myself in this position, I'm giving them the right to grab me until my lawyer can come in and we can try to work this out to see, was that really me on the video? And yeah, if it is me on the video, then yeah, they can put me away for 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I figured that would be your answer. I just wanted to make sure. And now I kind of want to flip the question on its head. Mm-hmm. Let's assume nobody or the person in question never signed anything. And so he ends up in the situation where most law-abiding people, let's say he's an axe murderer or whatever, and he's 20, kills a 7-Eleven full of Twinkie eaters.
Let's go lower healthcare costs. So if you think about it, if you do
he's a hero.
The Mercatus Center might favor cost benefit.
I mean, are we economists or not? So yeah, let's say that he gets convicted and a judgment is rendered and it's pretty airtight, and so no sensible human wants him on their property, so he ends up in one of these oases institutions that you're describing. Your critic on YouTube sort of envisions the ANCAP system like being too easy on criminals because they could always just retreat to their own gang property or something, but I'm envisioning like maybe we could end up in a situation where there's just no path to redemption for these people. Because once you're outcast, how do you prove to, say, an insurer who would have to underwrite, you know, your claim, and these people are risk averse? How would you ever get out of that situation? I mean, assume a path to redemption where the guy finds God and, you know, 20, 25 years later or the time period doesn't matter, but what path can this person have towards getting back into society that's sort of believable?
Okay, this is, if I may claim all due humility here, this is just the gorgeous element of my framework. I certainly came to this independently. Perhaps others have I haven't seen it spelled out like this, but maybe other people have done it and I just missed it, Tannehill or something. But in any event, the way I'm envisioning it is like this: that yes, you're some guy, you went nuts, you killed a bunch of people, they've got you, video footage. There's no doubt that you did it. And so yes, 99.9% of all the property owners in the region say you're not allowed on my property. You're going to starve to death. There's a few places, because even if you went to your house, let's say you have a house, I think that's what this guy's thinking. Like, oh no, you could retreat and maybe you and a bunch of other axe murderers all hang out in your clubhouse somewhere,
Right?
or even a farm. But unless you have enough pigs and stuff that you are self-sufficient, I mean, the power company can just shut off the power to you, and you got no internet. You can't get on Twitter. What are you going to do? Like, you're going to turn yourself in, I think. And so, again, like, just to say you can go to your own land, well, that's not doing too much if literally the whole community's boycotting you. So anyway, the way you get integrated in society is you go to one, and there's competition too, right? So it's not that you go in there and then the guards beat the crap out of you because you would just choose a different, what I mean? They're competing for your business, these places, because you're working in their walls under their supervision and they're earning money off of you. Like, that's their business model if they're for profit. Okay, so you're in a place like that, and then the issue is, okay, so that's why you're there, and then aren't you just there for life? Well, no, you're there. The community, they might have different levels of restriction. So a daycare is probably not going to ever let you in, period. If you, when you were younger, went nuts and with an axe and murdered 18 people. But some other, apartment complex for ex-cons might let you in, so long as there's at least one fraternal organization or an outright insurance company that says if he's convicted of a further crime, we will indemnify the victims up to $20 million.
Yep.
And then, but if nobody's willing to do that, then they say, no, you can't come here. You need to get someone to do it. And so then the answer is you have to find at least one organization that thinks you really are reformed. And if you're saying, but what if they can't? Well, we don't want those people out then. You know what I mean? You don't want it to be. So we need a system where some unaccountable bunch of bureaucrats interviews the guy for 10 minutes and says, I think he should be let back into society. Like, if it's literally that no one with their own money on the line would be willing to risk it because they think, no, we think there's too high a chance we might have to pay the $20 million to his victims, then you don't want that guy out.
Precisely. Yeah, I was hoping I was lobbing you a nice slow pitch over the plate.
That's me.
You cracked it. And
it's a metal bat, though.
As I was listening to your video, of course it's metal. It made me think just how stupid and counterproductive the government probation system is. But in Ancapistan, the probation system would be so useful and dynamic and helping these, ex-cons transition. And it would actually be something that's communicating actual relevant information back to, say, an insurance company or the kinds of private institutions that are really interested in rehabilitating people.
Exactly. And I don't mean that like, I really do as a Christian, and the power of mercy, and I love Les Mis and stuff like that, and how the bishop shows Jean Valjean mercy, and that's what flips him. So that's really why I am so passionate about this. That the prison would not be a place where you would go to get raped and then hang out with other criminals who are more seasoned than you and who would teach you tricks and then say, okay, when we get out of here, we got a job lined up and come call us. You know what I mean? Like, that's what happens right now. It's just awful, right? In terms of causing more, I mean, it's a trade-off that, you don't want to go to prison, so some people stay straight because of that, but it's also like once you start going down that path, you can see how, the system kind of takes you and gets carried away, and it solidifies your life as a criminal. And so, this system, like you're saying, it's not merely that, you go there for lack of a better place. No, they could make more money. You can make more money for them if they can get the community to open back up to you. Like, maybe there's only so much you can do from within their border, from within their walls with an internet connection. But, if you could get this guy to be able to go to this factory on a limited work release in the first couple of years to see how it goes. And he during the day he's got an ankle monitor on in case he runs. And he goes and works at this factory. It's other guys there. It's not, again, he's not going and babysitting infants. He's going to a factory with all the blue collar guys, and they're, and the foreman knows his history. Okay. And he's keeping an eye on it. And then, so he makes more money so that if, the rehabilitation company gets a 10% cut, they're like a temp agency or something. So they want his gross pay to be as high as possible. And so they will do what they can to rehabilitate them. And so, yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful because, of course, lots of people like you, Bob, are soft-hearted and actually love humanity and would be really interested in trying to make the world a better place by rehabbing these people and getting them integrated into society again. And so all the incentives of people like that would be coordinated through things like probation and these information transmission services, and they wouldn't just be bumping up against the intransigent state who's just got these dumb rules, and these dumb public employees are just following some bureaucratic thing where they don't really care if this guy gets out or gets better.
And again, there would be competition, right? So I don't know what the best way to rehabilitate somebody is. Maybe there'd be different things, and maybe it's, who knows what to do. So
I think it'll end up being an MK Ultra type thing with LSD and brainwashing, but I don't know.
It could be. A quick story. I went to it was the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. I don't know if I ever told you about this one, but it was anyway, we're sitting around and the guy was telling a story that he was watching some. So the people here, they were all like Christian or Jewish in terms of their faith. We were all economists or interested in that stuff. And so anyway, he was telling a story where it was some 60 Minutes or whatever, secular news documentary on prison recidivism, and they were interviewing these guys that, made it out and they stayed clean or whatever, like they didn't go back, they didn't reoffend. And so they're interviewing the guys to see what are the patterns. In like the first three guys, I'm being loose and goose here with the facts, but this is the spirit of what the guy was telling he saw on this 60 Minute show. And like the first three people were like, "Oh yeah, I found Jesus," and then by the fourth one, the person said, "Yeah, religion aside though, what did the prison do to like?" In other words, the interviewer didn't want to hear about like how
anything else, yeah. Anything else. That's funny. All right, I got a question for you that's not a soft, slow pitch down the middle.
Okay.
One of the hardest things for minarchists or statists to see is how a free society could handle big military problems, big invasions. And you were talking about it a little bit in your video that we're linking to. And you said something like insurance companies would be at the hub for this. They'd be on the hook for, how would insurance system, defend Manhattan, or how would they mitigate their damages, their risk assessment. And so you were laying out some things like, maybe they would have a bounty system for a large network of independent subcontractors for security services, where there'd be a bounty for, incoming aircraft or infantry and as you were describing it sounded pretty good, and you got a lot of competition in that system, which you were touting. But it made me wonder if you weren't overlooking the benefits that come from vertical integration in some industries. And if it did make sense to have the insurance company and then some military attached to it, that's where it's not just being contracted out and giving bounties, but it's in the vertical structure of one company, you start to wonder if that makes economic sense, just from a just from an economic analysis. Do we get closer to running into the danger that Robert Nozick warned us about in like Anarchy State and Utopia, where he just assumed that you'd end up with bigger and bigger military conglomerations such that they become warlords, and then one of them would take over and we're back to a government, or is that just too big a question?
Okay, so let me try it like this. I'm being Michael Malice in this episode, in the sense that instead of me answering it the standard way, I'm going to try to do a zinger and whatever.
Good.
And hopefully annoy you. So,
before you answer,
yes,
you did also throw a nod in that video that, again, we're linking to crowdsourcing big defense projects in a way that, your credit card doesn't get dinged until a very big number gets there. And just want to throw that out there as a very unique. There's a lot of once you get the government out of the way, there's a lot of unique ways to organize and fund things.
Well, yeah, and just real quickly on that, and then I'll circle back to your interesting thought experiment there a minute ago. the economic argument for government monopoly in something like military defense is like a combination of the free rider and public goods aspects of it. And so the idea is, oh yeah, if we could just, I'm making these numbers up obviously, folks, but if everybody would just kick in $1,000 a year, then that would collectively provide defense services to them that they value at, $50,000 a year. So it's totally worth it. But the thing is, you can't have the market provision of that, because if enough people are kicking in so that you're not going to get invaded, then it's in your narrow interest to not contribute anything. But since everybody thinks that, I say, okay, but if the disparity is really that big, that it's, 1,000 or whatever I say, 50 to 1 payout in terms of the value of what you're getting versus your contribution, there's all sorts of mechanisms you could use to get around that. And besides just, no, everybody kick in, and if we get enough, we're defended, and if we don't get enough, then we're not, then we all get invaded and we all speak German. Like that's goofy. In other words, there's all sorts of mechanisms to get around that issue besides, and so therefore we need to have Articles of Confederation. That's goofy. Okay.
It does seem like the laziest way to handle any
especially, in modern times with, the internet and credit card and options contracts and all, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, I could see how you could say in 1880, yeah, you needed something that you and I would say, oh, that's a government, like to do it just technologically or whatever. But nowadays, no, you don't need that, especially for a bustling society. And like, again, is like Afghanistan has shown, you don't need to spend that much to repel a really bigger, more well-funded army. And so the idea that Manhattan's going to get taken over by some external force when they've got trillions of dollars of wealth sitting there, like they just spend 0.1%, and they could easily repel, because they're not trying to take over the world and keep the shipping lanes open. All they're trying to do is say, we're going to make it so if you try to invade us, it is going to be so costly, you're going to say, no, we'll just trade with them. Okay. So anyway, back to your thing. Yeah, let's bite the bullet and just say, yep, through economies of scale and whatever, and this one insurance agency, they're just really good, and they hire the best snipers and and they just keep gaining market share because they're, it's a kind of thing where once they get to be the biggest one, and they provide really good customer service, and their billing's reasonable and whatever, they just, if it makes sense for them to have 30% of the market, well, then it should make sense for them to have 60, and then clearly they're going to have 80, and then then basically everybody's working for them. And so then they're going to say, aha, now that we've finally done this, now we're going to turn and we're going to institute, a 30% income tax, and we're going to, say you have to buy Obamacare, and we're going to, and so even there, notice the worst thing is, and what if they ended up giving us the system we have right now? Wouldn't that suck? So let's have the system right now to make sure that doesn't, you know what I mean? So it's kind of goofy that we're going right to the tyrannical system when, by many metrics, we have that right now. But okay. So then I want to say, oh, well, in that case, you know what my answer is? The people would just say, every 4 years, we're going to have a popularity contest, and we're going to pick who's in charge of this. And they're going to say, damn it. Because before we had this system where it was voluntary customer contracts, but now the public is insisting on voting, and that's how they're going to contain us. Foiled. I would have gotten away with it too if it hadn't been for you meddling Democrats with a small d.
I think
you could see, well, that wouldn't work, Bob. Right. And so why is your solution to that problem to say, let's have minarchy? It's, if you just admit it, that won't work. Why would,
Yeah, the answer to the question, I think, is embedded in that series of hilarious jokes. It's like the biggest impediment to just the big insurance company's security company turning into a warlord is the fact that you've got a populace who just thinks that's illegitimate. Because once you sweep away the public's belief in the legitimacy of some central government, once you take that away, well, people just aren't going to go for it. And that's the biggest thing that would let him. I mean, can you imagine the actual force of arms it would take to pacify all of America? No matter how big your defense company was.
Yeah, it's, again, just to make sure, let me try it a different way, less cheekily, is you say, oh no, but Bob, right now with our system, it's not just that you've got the Leviathan state and then we try to have election. No, we have checks and balances, because Right. And we're starting by stipulation from a system where we don't just have a bicameral legislature and the, executive, judicial. No, we've got where originally the entire police force is split up perhaps among 1,000 different little companies. And there's thousands of judges who all are competing with each other for market share, and and there's different legal codes that are very similar. Like, murder's illegal everywhere, clearly, but there's different shades and blah blah blah. And it's this splintered, fractured system where it's all decentralized, and there's thousands of power centers all jealously competing with each other. And then you're saying, yeah, but isn't it possible that step by step one subset of them just keeps striking deals and or wiping out competitors until it just keeps growing, and then takes over? And say, yes, I can't prove to you that that's literally impossible, but if that's what you're afraid of, starting with a system where you've already done 90% of the consolidation is crazy. Like, you're not preventing monopoly by saying, let's just have, 3 different organizations in charge, but we'll have them competing with each other. Like, the inbuilt competition is part of the framework that I described also.
Precisely. Plus, take heart in the almost certain fact that a vast majority of the public in such an Ancapistan free society would look with suspicion at the slow concentration of market share by one of these companies. Right. Some people would just go for the off-brand. They'd go for Alamo just because they're worried about Hertz or whatever. They don't like big. And especially if they've read their Nozick and don't want to see a warlord. So you'd have all this consumer pressure to keeping the thing decentralized, regardless of economies of scale, because nobody wants a monopoly. In your instinctual bones, nobody wants a monopoly, right?
Yeah, and also too, I think there could be regional issues. So, if we pictured the entire United States right now, continental at least, as Ancapistan, I think there would be, there could be agglomerations and economies of scale scattered throughout. And so, it might end up looking like, to the untrained eye, someone watching a movie about that might say, oh, there were like 600 different countries in what was formerly the United States.
Sure. And
you and I might use different terminology, but, for the lay person looking at that, that's what they would say. And they say, oh, okay. So, if a couple of them merge and they became, dubious and started doing things that those people could just move elsewhere. And again, it's no, just like, well, geez, what if the Mexican government really starts oppressing its people? Well, Dave Smith's not going to let them go north, but they could go elsewhere. So anyway, I'm just, again, it's redundant at this point, but as long yes, people can do bad things, and just having a bunch of rules written down somewhere is not going to stop them from doing it. But all the mechanisms in place by which you think you're going to contain your state will apply all the more so with decentralized market competition.
Amen. In your video, you said something I want to briefly quote. You said, quote, "No institution that systematically violates property rights," unquote, is a decent definition of a free society. Mm-hmm. And your critic on YouTube was so worried about, these gangs or whatever, and people just escaping justice or somehow becoming a problem. But again, we vastly outnumber the misanthropes. Crooks and frauds and invaders, we can deal with that. What we can't deal with is our property rights being violated under the color of law because it's supposedly for our own good or necessary to have a society. We've got to just wreck that myth, that lie.
Yeah. I don't know if this is going to help some people, but it really struck me that now I don't see it. Well, it's because I'm not on Facebook, I think. But back when I was on Facebook, I would notice that somebody would post some clear-cut example, like the cops have some lady, she's on the ground, handcuffed, hands behind her back, and they're kicking her with boots in the face. Yeah. And it's like, come on. And you will get people in the comments saying, oh, well, next time someone's breaking into your house, I guess you're going to call the pizza joint or something, meaning like cops take it or leave it kind of thing. And I want to say the reason that happens is that we have this monopoly provision of police services, that if it were 10 different agency, companies providing that, and one of them's doing that when they're apprehending a suspect, they would just go out of business, right? Just like if there's a story, someone posts a story on Facebook about, yeah, I went to this thing and look at this. It was disgusting. I opened up my chicken nuggets and there was maggots crawling all over. And then says, oh, well, next time you're hungry, I guess you're going to go eat a rock then, huh? It's not like, no, that, restaurants, yes or no. It's a particular restaurant, a chain, or even that one branch that, oh yeah, that particular franchise is run by a clown or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And it's because there's competition. So we don't think you have to choose between restaurants, yes or no, the way people do think they have to choose between police, yes or no.
Yeah. Again and again, it's because we've been educated in government schools for 100 years, and our society is just steeped with statism such that if you criticize the guy in the steel-toed boots just stomping the head of some defenseless lady, well, I guess you just want barbarianism and crime running rampant because clearly the system we have is the only way we can handle these problems.
Let me tell you another one. It's just, to this day, it blows my mind that this happened. So New York City, it was Abner Louima. Did that make, do you know that case? This was like late 90s, I think. So he was I think he was a Haitian immigrant or something. Don't tell Jeremy Kaufman, but, and I don't know what he was in custody for, but maybe he had, like, I'm kind of filling in some details. The spirit of this is certainly correct.
Do you know what his IQ was?
I mean, for people, anyway, Adam and I are doing inside jokes here. Okay. We're like poking fun of this other guy that's got strong views on IQ. So anyway, and by strong, I don't mean well supported necessarily. So anyway, I think maybe when they took him into custody, maybe he like punched some cops or something. There was some reason the cops didn't like this guy. So he's at the station, and this is documented, like they had to pay, a huge fine or something to the guy, and then the officers either got fired or, reprimanded or whatever. But they took him in the bathroom and sodomized him with a broom handle. Okay. He didn't die, but so anyway, so he gets this big settlement or whatever. And so that, it's the internal affairs, blah, blah, blah. And, there's a big scandal and whatever. And like I said, the cops, they got in trouble. I don't know the ones who did it. I don't know if they got fired. I can't remember. All right. So there's this big stink there for the NYPD. And then soon thereafter, it was the Puerto Rican Day parade. And things just got ahead, and there were, guys going around like ripping clothes off women, and just, they called it wilding, like going in the pools and doing stuff. And it was just crazy. And there were, firsthand accounts of like, this, woman would get attacked, or she'd get away, she'd run up, and they would see police just sitting on the steps of a courthouse or something and run up and say, hey, 2 blocks from here, there's, guys rampaging, and the cops are just like literally sitting down and not even standing up, not doing nothing. And so then the allegations started coming out that like they got orders from on high that, no, we're standing down, we're not doing this. And my grandma was commenting, was talking to my uncle or something after watching the news, and said, it's like, and I heard someone from the police say, damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I was just like, what the hell? So I think that was the first article I wrote for LouRockwell.com, as it was, don't let the police off the hook. And I went through and, and was explaining, like, no, we should not have to choose between, hey, if you don't want the police to sodomize a suspect with the broom handle in the bathroom when he's, in custody, it wasn't like he was trying to moon them, and out of self-defense, they pulled, what I mean? No, it was, he was clearly in their power, and they were doing that just to brutalize the guy. Like that was the choice. If you're saying cops can't do that, well, then don't expect them to rescue women who are being assaulted by, unruly guys in this parade. I mean, make your choice, New Yorkers. Which is it? Jeez. Which is it? Like that's insane.
Defenders of a monopoly system like the one we have are in a real tough spot, because they'll listen to economists like you explain the problem with monopoly is you get too little of the good, security and justice, at too high a price, police pensions. Then their eyes just glaze over. And then you look at the system where the cop is just mashing the face of some defenseless woman and sitting on their butt watching Puerto Ricans go wilding, or whatever was happening during the summer of love with BLM, where they sure as heck weren't defending the property and person of the average citizen. And then if you do something to try and protect your yourself, well, the cops probably will show up and take care of you then. So people who are just reflexively back the blue, like, I get it. You don't, you want law and order and you don't want mayhem, but you are supporting a system, a monopoly that is going to give you mayhem. How can
By
you
the
not
way,
see that?
Yeah, I should clear. So it is Abner Lima is the case that I'm talking about. People want to look that up. Also, it was definitely the Puerto Rican Day Parade. I am not saying that the assailants were necessarily Puerto Rican. I don't think they were Swedish. I'm going to say that, but I want to clarify that I
Duly noted. Duly noted. It is way too late to bring up this subject, so please don't give a definitive answer. But, you know, most people who are statists and think that an ANCAP system just can't be, they really do swallow that public goods concept. And I think that's just a total fraud. It's a lazy man's way of convincing the public that they'd better just fork over their money for some idea, because if you guys aren't taxed for it, then the good will be produced in too little quantity. And I just hate the concept. I wish economists had never have invented it. It's obviously arbitrary. You know, specific examples of things that are public goods you could see provided in a free market. And when at the end of the day, I just think it's an illegitimate concept, and I want it stabbed to death and burned with fire.
Yeah, when I was younger, I probably would have been more sympathetic. But yeah, the older I get and the more I see, I think it is true that economists in general, especially in the 20th century, you know, are very smart guys, mostly men, very, you know, mathematically inclined or whatever. And yeah, they have strong political biases, you know, things that they want the government to do. And they're going to come up with a way to have a model in which that's the right thing for the government to do. And so they think they're being real rigorous when they would. And for me, the greatest example of that is Kenneth Arrow's famous impossibility theorem, where he showed in general, you have a bunch of individual subjective rankings of various possible outcomes for society. Just, you know, very abstract framework, just, you know, A, B, C, D, E, you know, a bunch of different possible outcomes, and then how do people rank them ordinally? And then he just showed, you know, if you're trying to map from that set of the population's rankings to a social welfare order, and, you know, one thing that represents society's ranking, and, you know, presumably you would think as a Democrat with a small d, that surely the way the individuals feel about the various outcomes should have some bearing to how society does, right? And he came up with a very broad, you know, very loose list. The way the story goes is he was just trying to rule out crazy mappings. And so he said, like, for example, if every single person in society prefers A to B, then the social welfare ordering should prefer A to B. Stuff like that, right? And there shouldn't be intransitivity, right? So if the social welfare ordering says A is better than B and B is better than C, it shouldn't say that C is better than A, because that doesn't make any sense, right? So he was just going through real things. Some of them were a little bit technical and it's hard to convey here, but when you understood what he was saying, I was like, yeah, that's pretty reasonable. And then, so he showed, and then one of them was non-dictatorship. And this was a very loose, very light condition, just said, it shouldn't be the case that there's one individual that no matter what his orderings are, that's always identical to what the social orderings are, right? So it's okay if in a particular instantiation that, you know, the way he orders every last little thing is exactly what, it just can't be that that's always going to be the case, the way that whatever the mapping, right? That seems pretty straightforward. And Arrow proved, and so the way the story goes, I don't know if this is true, but this is how it was taught to me, that Arrow just started going through, he was just trying to weed out the nut job mappings to concentrate, you know, his work in graduate school on the sensible ones in terms of social choice theory and blah, blah, blah. And so he's going through and proved, he was left with the empty set. That he said with all those various, very completely unobjectionable assumptions about what a good social welfare mapping would look like, he realized, he proved it's impossible for anyone to satisfy all those. And the way the proof worked, it's cool, is if you assume it satisfies the other ones, then there necessarily exists a dictator. Like, that's just the way, you know, anyway, it's a neat little proof. So, but, so that's that. And my joke is, and he did that like in the 60s. And I said, and so that's why from 1969 onward, no economist or political scientist has ever thought that democracy can work because it was proven mathematically. No, obviously that's not what they just went, that's really unexpected. Okay, so why don't we instead model it like, blah, 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 how do we get around that?
We will also link in the show notes to a previous Haman Nature episode where Tyrone and I go over a video that is decrying all the various ways that we vote in our democratic system. And that example you just gave was one of the things they trotted out. Mm-hmm. And so the point of the whole episode is a little different. But it is amazing how we learn these truths and then just shrug and move right along and say, so anyway, we'll see you at the next election and everything's going to be great. The system's awesome.
I even had a guy I'm sorry, but I even had a guy one time, an economist. Shoot, I forget what the original thing was, but he and I were arguing about something over email, and we were lightly going back and forth. I forget what it was. But I said something, like I pointed to some defect in the way the government was doing something. And then he shot back and said, well, arrows showed that no matter what they do, there's going to be a flaw. So in other words, he had flipped it such that now whatever the government did was fine because we'd proven that anything they do was going to be flawed. So therefore, you know, I mean, it was half tongue in cheek, but he was also kind of half serious. And I was just like, no, if you prove that no matter what the government does, it's bad, that shouldn't be therefore endorsing everything the government does. Like they don't know how they approach the market. That sure as heck isn't the way they roll when it comes to the fundamental welfare theorems about, decentralized market outcomes.
Yeah, it's like, what do you guys think you're studying? It's like a guy walking into the boiler room of a building and opening it up. There's an enormous fire. He just shrugs, closes the door, walks on. I mean, are we studying these things or not? I've run out of my questions.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, is there any final words you have for this critic of yours who was kind enough to watch your video and leave you a comment?
Nah, I mean, we kind of touched on, again, just this last thing, he says, I can say yes to minarchy, but I can't agree with anarcho-capitalism. If it fails at the thought experiment level, it will definitely fail in the real world. Yeah, so that, I think he's wrong there on two scores. So one is, like, as we said, he didn't disprove that he didn't show, it doesn't even work even theoretically, as we put, or at the very least, the thing he pointed to, that this is what could go wrong with it, that could also go wrong with minarchy. So that's not, in other words, if you said, anarchy doesn't work because what if a giant asteroid came and blew up the earth? You can't prove to me that your private decentralized things could build a missile that would, so for a big enough thing, well, yeah, no matter what, humanity's dead.
Everything except the status quo state has to battle against utopia or it loses.
So, so there's that element, but then also when he's saying, minarchy, I mean, again, I would say, all right, minarchy, like, I would think, if anything, the anarchy, what it could have in its favor is it hasn't really been tried very much. Now you could ask why, and that's, maybe we'll do that in a different episode. But the point is, I don't think that's been tried and failed. Whereas the minarchy, clearly has been tried a few times, and certainly most famously, the U.S. And people always come, see, the thing we got wrong was and okay, but again, we're ultimately, I think we're all kind of doing the same thing. And someone says, no, we're going to do it this time. And if we had this tweak and a balanced budget amendment, then it would work. Or
then it would work.
Had
term limits will fix everything.
Pass the post voting or whatever these terms are. That'll fix it. Okay. But again, so I'm saying, okay, how about, chaos theory by Robert Murphy? Let's try that. If we're just throwing stuff at the wall here.
I second that motion. All right. Well, this was great, Bob. Thank you for that video. Thank you for this episode. Check the video description for show notes, and you can also find them at bobmurphyshow.com and also at hamannature.substack.com, where I write articles. You should subscribe. And also check out my YouTube for my show, Haman Nature, Haman Nature. Thanks again, Bob, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.